Hello, my name's Tom Allen-Stevens. I'm editor of Crop Production magazine. I'm also a farmer in Oxfordshire, and I'm here today with Dr. Susannah Bolton and Dr. Vicky Foster of HGCA. And we're looking at a report that has recently been undertaken by Reading University, looking at the likely economic and environmental impact of genetically modified cereals and oilseeds for UK agriculture. So what I'd like to know is why has the HGCA undertaken this research then?
So we felt it was really important that a review was undertaken, and this review was not conducted within HGCA. It was actually done by a third party, so it was completely independent of HGCA. And it was looking more into some of the facts and figures of what might happen if GM cereals and oilseeds come into the UK. So lots of reports have happened previously, and there's lots of evidence out there, but they've not all been specifically focused actually on the UK market. So they might look at crops that aren't relevant, traits that aren't relevant. So this really is kind of a gathering of information to provide some evidence that can inform future debate on the use of GM in the UK.
GM is a really emotive subject, and as Vicky said, there are lots of reports, lots of people making cases for and against, and we felt that it was important to develop an independent evidence base that was robust. Right. To inform a future debate so that we can be better prepared as an industry, that wasn't distorted by misinformation or by speculation, and that really built on the best scientific evidence that was there based on a review and on modelling the situation for UK farmers.
So how did you go about this then, or how did the research team go about it?
So we actually sort of pulled together a research call on some of the ideas that we thought we needed to gather some information on. So some of them around some of the impacts on the environment, sort of cost of production, focusing on some of the issues the supply chain might face. And then we put that out as an open call so people could bid into that. And we had a number of bids that came forward from different organisations, but the team at Reading, they had a lot of expertise in conducting similar reviews and pieces of work on GM, and we felt that they would be very good people to conduct this research because of the reasons and their past experience in this area.
Right. And can we be sure that they're impartial?
Yes, I think so. I mean, if you look at the actual review, they've done a massive global review, so they've looked at over 170 different sort of publications. They've taken a good stance across Europe. I mean, one of the things that we really emphasised in the call was that this isn't a pro-GM review and it isn't an anti-GM review. We actually had no idea what the outcome would be, and we would let the facts and figures speak for themselves. And I think that's exactly what you get within this review. It states where some things actually it's maybe not going to be advantageous for the UK, in other areas where it will be. So I think it does come across as broadly looking at all sides of the argument from that point of view.
Well, let's look at the economic aspects, because this is obviously, what myself as a farmer really wants to know about, and I'm sure a lot of other farmers want to know as well. So is it going to pay to go into GM?
In the right situations, then it could do, because it will actually give farmers another tool in their toolbox to use. So if we look at examples, some of the review focused on looking at impacts of sort of pests and weed pressure. And this is really because we asked them to look at different scenarios that would be more relevant to the UK. So the fact actually that there's already traits out there for insect-resistant maize, herbicide-tolerant oilseed rape, then these are likely that these could come into the UK in the next 5 to 10 years. So there's no point then focusing on genes that have hardly been developed or in crops that aren't relevant. So actually then they did a modelling piece of work that would look at what could be the impact and when would it pay, and they did find that unless there was a continued pressure or a high weed pressure or pest pressure, then actually it may not pay to go down the route of GM compared with conventional cropping. But where you do have that continued pressure, then you can use it as a tool to gradually bring down that pressure, and actually then obviously there will be benefits on less input costs for growers, multiple benefits then when you look at less trafficking across the soil, benefits for the environment then, because obviously you're not applying some of the herbicides or pesticides that you would have been applying. So it's not just about terms of actually finance, but it's also about their farm in general, about some of the benefits they can have from better soil sort of cultivation and sort of things like that. So it's benefit for the farmer, but we're not just talking about just reducing sort of costs and sort of money in the pocket at the end of the day.
Yes, I mean, what are the costs that we're talking about here? So if you were to go into GM, what are the sort of costs that growers can expect to face?
Obviously, there is a premium to pay for the cost of the development of the technology.
Right.
There's also costs associated with coexistence.
Oh, coexistence measures. Now, I've
Yeah.
heard about these. And I think they do operate over Europe in other contexts as well. Could you
Yeah.
just tell me what coexistence measures are?
In very simple terms, it's about ensuring that you keep products that need to be labelled differently separate.
Right.
So if GM labelling is one of the key issues associated with marketing any future GM product, the anticipation would be that you would have to keep your GM produce separate from your non-GM conventional produce, and very definitely separate from, for example, organic. So in order to ensure that there wasn't transfer or contamination between those two different types of product, you would need to ensure that sufficient distance was kept between fields growing different types of produce. So,
Right,
so those measures would cost a farmer.
So in practice, what does that mean in the field then? Do we know yet? Have there been any measures laid down in the UK?
Well, there are some of the measures the farmer might need to put in place. Might be some of their field boundaries, some of their margins, things like that,
Right.
which obviously is going to be an extra sort of time and a cost to lay out some of these different sort of plans and margins in the first place. But I think it's felt that actually a lot of the cost would be up front, but once that's established, then obviously proportionally that would reduce through time. So whilst you might have to, as Susannah said, invest in different sort of areas of grain stores, barns, things like that, once you've had the upfront cost, then it's sort of there, and then obviously that doesn't deteriorate. So when we sort of talked through the supply chain, again they felt that this wouldn't be something they could see would really have a detrimental impact going forward in the future, and they say the little bit of effort up front, but then people would just kind of get on with business as usual once that's made.
Well, I suppose a lot of the supply chain are already dealing
Yeah.
with GM crops because they import it.
Yeah.
So as far as they're concerned, they've already got the structure in place. Is that the case?
Obviously there's imported GM soya animal feed that comes into the UK sort of from outside. So some areas of the supply chain are dealing with that, but it can be obviously slightly different when we're talking about perhaps some of your milling wheats and your malting barley, and particularly some of these sort of long-term markets, for example, the malting industry, where what they're actually sort of growing and buying today is something they're going to sell in 10-20 years time. So obviously they have got to think much more long term about anything that happens today and any sort of changes in the market and what impact that's going to have on their business in that sort of much longer term. It's not just about what you grow and sell today or tomorrow.
Right. Well, let's just look at that, because the crops that we're talking about, I think, aren't we, is just herbicide tolerant oilseed rape and BT maize, which is tolerant to European corn borer, for example. Is that right?
That's what some of the scenario modelling was based on as things that literally, if the UK decided to go down the route of accepting GM crops, could come in to the UK today, and then drought tolerance things are in the pipeline that would be further down the line. But yes, I mean herbicide tolerant oilseed rape is one of the big ones that actually people could just get on and start using that technology as part of their programme of weed control in rape.
So it looks, like good news. I mean, as far as I can see from the report, it's going to be an economic benefit for most farmers. It's going to be a benefit for the environment too. Of course, one of the big sticking points has always been market acceptability.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this is something that was tackled in the report at all. Would you like to just sort of talk us through those sorts of aspects?
Yeah, so one of the things that this review we actually didn't specifically include was about that kind of public perception and the sort of marketing issue. So really we wanted to focus on the science side of it. So this is a scientific sort of tool and technology development, but obviously there is great recognition that actually without an end market, this debate is irrelevant to some extent, because if consumers won't accept the products, growers have to sell product that consumers want, and so it is a vicious supply chain, which is why, as we said at the start of the interview, actually this is really about providing evidence to feed into that debate that then can be taken, looking at sort of the pros and cons on the bigger picture.
So this is very much focused on the science then, right?
Yes.
In terms of that, it does come out with a very glowing report in favour of GM. Does this mean that AHTB is pro-GM?
I think the point that Vicky made earlier is really important, that we have to provide the evidence that can inform the debate, but then we live in a market economy. And at the end of the day, we are totally reliant as farmers and as processors to sell our products into that market. And unless there's proper consumer acceptance of the technology, then those products won't be sold. So I think we have to put it into the context of the market. And whilst AHDB is very supportive of research in the development of the technology, supportive of the sort of research to build the evidence base to inform the debate as we have done. What we can't do is actually make a statement about how these products would perform in that market economy. So it's very important to look at it in the context of that bigger picture.
And also important to say that, AHDB, we don't have any role in lobbying for, this technology one way or another. We're all about providing independent evidence and information. We don't go down the road of lobbying, and there are, other organisations out there that will take up that role for the UK.
I see. So let's just look at the timeline here. Let's say there was a government announcement on GM crops within the next 6 months. How soon could we see GM crops on the farm?
It's too big a question, I think, Tom. I come back to that point that we have to think about it in the context of the whole supply chain.
Sure.
And interestingly, a recent Food Standards Agency report that came out, I think, in November, indicated that actually the public perception is starting to tip back towards that slightly more negative view of the technology. And it's very difficult for us to predict what might happen in terms of further acceptance. And I think the further rollout of the technology in the UK is going to be very, very dependent upon that.
Well, if we sort of set aside that marketing aspect or the consumer acceptability aspect to begin with, do we have varieties there that are ready to plant in the UK? Let's take BT maize, for example. Is there any reason why we can't take varieties that are already there, available, off the shelf, and as long as we can legally do so, stick them in the ground?
I guess it would depend on some of those varieties and the suitability to UK conditions. So obviously the genes that have been incorporated in those varieties to provide the herbicide tolerance or insect resistance. But whether to say that particular variety that's used in Spain or Portugal or whether would suit our market conditions is again another piece of work. And I imagine then it would be down to plant breeders to then look at that technology and actually use it in varieties that are more specific to those UK conditions. So it's not as easy as you say going over to the States and buying some seed and being able to plant that and say we've got it. It would still need further work. But at least we could start to benefit from these these genes and the technology, but obviously in the UK context.
Would the varieties have to go through national listing?
Yes, they would.
Yeah. Right.
And I think that there is an important point there that actually the technology is only going to be really valuable. We're only going to realise the value of the technology if we have the appropriate agronomy to go alongside it.
Right.
And at the moment there hasn't been the development of that agronomy to work alongside the varieties. The varieties would have to go through the normal processes of registration for the UK markets. And of course, we have our own system of recommendation of varieties. And in the future, one day, we might envisage a scenario where GM varieties would be coming through the system. But we are quite some way away from that at the moment.
So, and finally, in terms of one of the things that you pointed out, Susannah, is we don't know much about these varieties. We don't know the agronomy about it. Have you got an idea of what sort of work needs to be done looking at these varieties in the field?
I think it depends so much on the crop and on the trait that you're talking about. Obviously, herbicide-tolerant traits require quite different sorts of agronomy to work alongside them than other traits that confer different resistances to insects or potentially quality traits. So actually, it depends very, very much on the crop and the trait that we're talking about.
But I think what's quite important to emphasise, obviously we have learnt a lot of 20 years of growing crops over, sort of globally and in the States, and it's a tool, it is not a silver bullet, and if you have herbicide tolerant rape, we know, and you know, it is not unique to GM, best practice, you still have to manage that agronomy in the appropriate way. You still have to use, you know, your appropriate rotation of herbicides and modes of action. You know, you can't just use reliance on a single product, which we know will develop resistance very quickly. So again, it's a technology with a caveat that it's not the answer, it's just part of a programme amongst everything else and all the other decisions that growers have to make on their farm.
And presumably, you know, once we know a little bit more about, for example, when we're actually going to be able to use these crops and whether there's going to be much market acceptability, presumably you'll be putting out research calls for work into them specifically?
I think as and when there's a need to develop new information for the UK, then that is the point that, you know, we would get involved. So this was a starting point, looking at the evidence base. But if, you know, these things become closer to, you know, sort of adoption and use in the UK, then, you know, as and when appropriate, we will commission relevant research that will help to develop that, you know, that agronomy and that type of work to support growers.
Great.
We're working in fairly close collaboration with the plant breeders, particularly with the recommended lists, and understanding what sorts of new technologies are coming through the system. So we've just been through a process of actually consulting with them to try and identify what demands the new technologies might place on the variety testing and on further agronomy research. So it's going to be quite a dynamic environment, something that we're going to have to keep quite a close eye on in terms of our future strategy.
Well, thank you, Susannah. Thank you, Vicky. And if you'd like to have a look at that report, you'll find it on the HGCA website. That's www.hgca.com/genetics. Thank you very much.